Here we go. We got some more Hermann Hess. This is the Steppenwolf Treatise on the Steppenwolf. There was once a man, Harry, called the Steppenwolf. He went on 2 legs, wore clothes, and was a human being. But nevertheless, he was in reality a wolf of the steppes. He had learned a good deal of all that people of a good intellect or intelligence can, and was a fairly clever fellow. What he had not learned, however, was this: to find contentment in himself and his own life. The cause of this, apparently, was that at the bottom of his heart he knew all the time, or thought he knew, that he was in reality not a man, but a wolf of the steppes. Clever men might argue the point whether he truly was a wolf, whether, that is, he had been changed, before birth perhaps, from a wolf into a human being, or had been given the soul of a wolf, though born as a human. Or whether, on the other hand, this belief that he was a wolf was no more than a fancy or a disease of his. It might, for example, be possible that in his childhood he was a little wild and disobedient and disorderly, and that those who brought him up had declared a war of extinction against the beast in him. And precisely this had given him the idea and the belief that he was, in fact, actually a beast, with only a thin covering of the human. On this point one could speak at length and entertainingly, and indeed write a book about it. The Steppenwolf, however, would be none the better for it, since for him it was all one whether the wolf had been bewitched or beaten into him, or whether it was merely an idea of his own. What others chose to think about it, or what he chose to think himself, was no good to him at all. It left the wolf inside him just the same. And so the Steppenwolf had 2 natures, a human and a wolfish one. This was his fate. And it was, or it may well be that it was not a very exceptional one. There must have been many men who have had a good deal of the dog or the fox or the fish or the serpent in them, without experiencing any extraordinary difficulties on that account. In such cases, the man and the fish lived on together, and neither did the other any harm. The one even helped the other. Many a man, indeed, has carried this condition to such an enviable lengths, that he has owed his happiness more to the fox or the ape in him than to the man. So much for common knowledge. In the case of Harry, however, it was just the opposite. In him, the man and the wolf did not go the same way together, but were in continual deadly enmity. One existed simply and solely to harm the other. And when there are 2 in one blood, and in one soul, who are at deadly enmity, then life fares ill well. To each his lot, and none is light. Now we're with our Steppenwolf, It was so that in his conscious life he lived now as a wolf, now as a man, as indeed the case is with all mixed beings. But when he was a wolf, the man in him lay in ambush, ever on the watch to interfere and condemn. Well, at those times that he was a man, the wolf did just the same. For example, if Harry, as man, had a beautiful thought, felt a fine and noble emotion, or performed a so-called good act, then the wolf bared his teeth at him and laughed, and showed him with bitter scorn how laughable this whole pantomime was in the eyes of a beast. Of a man who knew well enough in his heart what suited him, namely, to trot alone over the steps, and now and then to gorge himself with blood, or to pursue a female wolf. Then, wolfishly seen, all human activities became horribly absurd and misplaced, stupid and vain. But it was exactly the same with Harry. Felt and behaved as a wolf, and showed others his teeth, and felt hatred and enmity against all human beings and their lying and degenerate manners and customs. For then the human part of him lay in ambush and watched the wolf, called him brute and beast, and spoiled and embittered for him all pleasure in his simple and healthy and wild wolf's being. Thus it was then with the Steppenwolf, and one may well imagine that Harry did not have an exactly pleasant and happy life of it. This does not mean, however, that he was unhappy in any extraordinary degree, although it may have seemed so to himself all the same, inasmuch as every man takes the sufferings that fall to his share as the greatest. That cannot be said of any man. Even he who has no wolf in him may be none the happier for that. And even the unhappiest life has its sunny moments and its little flowers of happiness between sand and stone. So it was, then, with the Steppenwolf, too. It cannot be denied that he was generally very unhappy, and he could make others unhappy also. That is, when he loved them or they him. For all who got to love him saw always only the one side in him. Many loved him as a refined and clever and interesting man, and were horrified and disappointed when they had come upon the wolf in him. And they had to, because Harry wished, as every sentient being does, to be loved as a whole, and therefore it was just with those who love he most valued that he could least of all conceal and belie the wolf. There were those, however, who loved precisely the wolf in him, the free, the savage, the untamable, the dangerous and strong. And these found it peculiarly disappointing and deplorable when suddenly the wild and wicked wolf was also a man, and had hankerings after goodness and refinement, and wanted to hear Mozart, to read poetry, and to cherish human ideals. Usually, these were the most disappointed and angry of all. And so it was that the Steppenwolf brought his own dual and divided nature into the destinies of others besides himself whenever he came into contact with them. Now, whoever thinks that he knows the Steppenwolf, and that he can imagine to himself his lamentably divided life, is nevertheless in error. He does not know all by a long way. He does not know that, as there is no rule without an exception, and as one sinner may, under certain circumstances, be dearer to God than 90, and 9 righteous persons, with Harry, too, there were now and then exceptions and strokes of good luck, and that he could breathe and think and feel sometimes as the wolf, sometimes as the man, clearly and without confusion of the two. And even on very rare occasions they made peace and lived for one another in such fashion that not merely did one keep watch whilst the other slept, but each strengthened and confirmed the other. In the life of this man, too, as well as in all things else in the world, daily use and the accepted and common knowledge seemed sometimes to have no other aim than to be arrested. Now and again, for an instance, and broken through in order to yield the place of honor to the exceptional and miraculous. Now, whenever these short and occasional hours of happiness balanced and alleviated the lot of the Steppenwolf in such a fashion that in the shot or upshot happiness and suffering held the scales even, or whether perhaps the short but intense happiness of those few hours outweighed all suffering and left a balance over, is again a question over which idle persons may meditate to their heart's content. Even the wolf brooded often over this, and those were his ideal or idle and unprofitable days. In this connection, one thing must be said. There are a good many people of the same kind as Harry. Many artists are of his kind. These persons all have 2 souls, 2 beings within them. There is God and the devil in them, the mother's blood and the father's, the capacity for happiness and the capacity for suffering. And in just such a state of enmity and entanglement towards and within each other as were the wolf and man in Harry. And these men, for whom life has no repose, live at times in their rare moments of happiness with such strength and indescribable beauty The spray of their moment's happiness is flung so high and dizzyingly over the wide sea of suffering that the light of it, spreading its radiance, touches others too with its enchantment. Thus, like a precious, fleeting foam over the sea of suffering, arise all those works of art in which a single individual lifts himself for an hour so high above his personal destiny that his happiness shines like a star and appears to all who see it as something eternal and as a happiness of their own. All these men, whatever their deeds and works may be, have really no life. That is to say, their lives are not their own and have no form. They are not heroes, artists, or thinkers in the same way the other men are judges, doctors, shoemakers, or schoolmasters. Hold on. Their life consists of a perpetual tide, unhappy and torn with pain, terrible and meaningless, unless one is ready to see its meaning in just those rare experiences, acts, thoughts, and works that shine out above the chaos of such a life. To such men, the desperate and horrible thought has come that perhaps the whole of human life is but a bad joke, a violent and ill-fated abortion of the primal mother, a savage and dismal catastrophe of nature. To them, too, however, the other thought has come that man is perhaps not merely a half-rational animal, but a child of the gods and destined to immortality. Men of every kind have their characteristics, their features, their virtues and vices, and their deadly sins. Prowling about at night was one of the Steppenwolf's favorite tendencies. The morning was a wretched time of day for him. He feared it, and it never brought him any good. Oh, no morning of his life had he ever been in good spirits, nor done any good before midday, nor ever had a happy idea, nor devised any pleasure for himself or others. By degrees, during the afternoon, he warmed and became alive. And only towards evenings, on his good days, was he productive, active, and sometimes aglow with joy. With this was bound up his need for loneliness and independence. There was never a man with a deeper and more passionate craving for independence than he. In his youth, when he was poor and had difficulty in earning his bread, he preferred to go hungry and in torn clothes rather than endanger his narrow limits of independence. He never sold himself for money, for an easy life, or to women, or to those in power, and had thrown away 100 times what in the world's eyes was his advantage. and happiness in order to safeguard his liberty. No prospect was more hateful and distasteful to him than that he should have to go to an office and conform to daily and yearly routines and obey others. He hated all kinds of offices, governmental or commercial, and he hated death, and his worst nightmare was confinement in barracks. He contrived often, at great sacrifice, to avoid all such predicaments. It was here that his strength and his virtue rested. On this point he could neither be bent nor bribed. Here his character was firm and indeflectible. Only through this virtue he was bound the closer to his destiny of suffering. It happened to him, as it does to all, what he strove for with the deepest and most stubborn instinct of his being fell to his lot. But more than is good for men, in the beginning, his dream and his happiness. In the end, it was his bitter fate. The man of power is ruined by power, the man of money by money. The submissive man by subservience, the pleasure-seeker by pleasure. He achieved his aim. He was ever more independent. He took orders from no man, and ordered his ways to suit no man. Independently and alone, he decided what to do and to leave undone. For every strong man attains to that which a genuine impulse bids him seek. But in the midst of the freedom he had attained, Harry suddenly became aware that his freedom was a death, and that he stood alone. The world, in an uncanny fashion, left him in peace. Other men concerned him no longer. He was not even concerned about himself. He began to suffocate slowly in the more and more rarefied atmosphere of remoteness and solitude. For now it was his wish no longer, nor his aim, to be alone and independent, but rather his lot and his sentence. The magic wish had been fulfilled and could not be cancelled, and it was no good now to open his arms with longing and goodwill to welcome the bonds of society. People left him alone now. It was not, however, that he was an object of hatred and repugnance. On the contrary, he had many friends. A great many people liked him, but it was no more than sympathy and friendliness. He received invitations, presents, pleasant letters, but no more. No one came near to him. There was no link left, and no one could have had any part in his life, even had anyone wished it. For the air of lonely men surrounded him now, a still atmosphere in which the world around him slipped away, leaving him incapable of relationship. an atmosphere against which neither will nor longing avail. This was one of the significant earmarks of his life. Okay, almost done. It gets a little crazy here in this next part, but bear with me. Hold on, baby boy. I'm almost there. Okay. Another was that he numbered among the suicides. And here it must be said that to call suicides only those who actually destroy themselves is false. Among these, indeed, there are many who, in a sense, are suicides only by accident, and whose being suicide has no necessary place. Among the common run of man, there are many of little personality, and stamped with no deep impress of faith, who find their end in suicide without belonging on that account to the type of the suicide by inclination, while on the other hand, of those who are to be counted as suicides by the very nature of their beings are many, perhaps a majority, who never in fact lay hands on themselves. The suicide, and Harry was one, need not necessarily live in a peculiarly close relationship to death. One may do this without being a suicide. What is peculiar to the suicide is that his ego, rightly or wrongly, is felt to be an extremely dangerous, dubious, and doomed germ of nature, that he is always in his own eyes exposed to an extraordinary risk, as though he stood with the slightest foothold on the peak of a crag, whence a slight push from without or an instant's weakness from within suffices to precipitate him into the void. The line of fate in the case of these men is marked by the belief they have that suicide is their most profitable or probable manner of death. I tried. It might be presumed that such temperaments, which usually manifest themselves in early youth and persist throughout life, show a singular defect of vital force. On the contrary, among the suicides are to be found unusually tenacious and eager, and also hardy natures. But just as there are those who, at the last indisposition, develop a fever, so do those men who call suicides, and whom are always very emotional and sensitive, develop at the least shock the notion of suicide. Had we a science with the courage and authority to concern itself with mankind, instead of with the mechanism merely of vital phenomena, had we something of the nature of an anthropology or a psychology, these matters of fact would be familiar to everyone. What was said above on the subject of suicides touches, obviously, nothing but the surface. It is psychology, and therefore partially physics. Metaphysically considered, the matter has a different and a much clearer aspect. In this aspect, suicide or suicides present themselves as those who are overtaken by the sense of guilt inherent in individuals. Those souls that find the aim of life not in the perfecting and molding of the self, but in liberating themselves by going back to the Mother, back to God, back to the All. Many of these natures are wholly incompatible of ever having recourse to real suicide, because they have a profound consciousness of the sin of doing so. For us, they are suicides, nonetheless, for they see death and not life as the releaser. They are ready to cast themselves away and surrender, to be extinguished and to go back to the beginning. As every strength may become a weakness, and under some circumstances must, so, on the contrary, may the typical suicide find a strength and a support in his apparent weakness. Indeed, he does so more often than not. The case of Harry, the Steppenwolf, is one of these. As thousands of his like do, he found consolation and support, and not merely the melancholy play of youthful fancy, in the idea that the way to death was open to him at any moment. It is true that with him, as with all men of his kind, every shock, every pain, every untoward predicament at once called forth the wish to find an escape in death. By degrees, however, he fashioned for himself, out of this tendency, a philosophy that was actually serviceable to life. He gained strength through familiarity with the thought that the emergency exit stood always open, and became curious, too, to taste his suffering to the dregs. If it went too badly with him, he could feel sometimes with a grim, malicious pleasure, I am curious to see, all the same, just how much a man can endure. If the limit of what is bearable is reached, I have only to open the door to escape. There are a great many suicides to whom this thought imparts an uncommon strength. On the other hand, all suicides have the responsibility of fighting against the temptation of suicide. Every one of them knows very well, in some corner of his soul, that suicide, though a way out, is rather a mean and shabby one, and that it is nobler and finer to be conquered by life than to fall by one's own hand. Knowing this, with a morbid conscience, whose source is much the same as that of the militant conscience of so-called self-contented persons, the majority of suicides are left to a procrastinated struggle against their temptation. They struggle as the kleptomaniac against his own vice. The Steppenwolf was not unfamiliar with this struggle. He had engaged in it with many a change of weapons. Finally, at the age of 47, or thereabouts, a happy and not unhumorous idea came to him, from which he often derived some amusement. He appointed his 50th birthday as the day on which he might allow himself to take his own life. On this day, according to his mood, so he agreed with himself, it should be open to him to employ the emergency exit or not. Let happen to him what might, illness, poverty, suffering, and bitterness. There was a time limit. It could not extend beyond these few years, months, days, whose number daily diminished. And in fact, he bore much adversity, which previously would have cost him severer and longer tortures, and shaken him, perhaps to the roots of his being, very much more easily. When, for any reason, it went particularly badly with him, with peculiar pains and penalties were added to his desolateness and loneliness and savagery of his life, he could say to his tormentors, "Only wait 2 years, and I am your master." And with this, he cherished the thought of the morning of his 50th birthday. Letters of congratulations would arrive, while he, relying on his razor, took leave of all his pains, and closed the door behind him. Then gout in the joints, depression of spirits, and all pains of head and body could look for another victim. Much like venom, that is. Anyway, that was what I'm going to read from the Steppenwolf today. And I'm sorry about all the dying talk. We're not going to do any of that. But please like and subscribe, and I'll try to continue next time. Later.